us to think about new ways of approaching the mannequins too. So we came up with this idea of the gartered leg that's attached to the torso, but it's a little bit flexible and the feet are weighted as much as it's safe to weight them so that we can move them into a position on site and have some flexibility there, depending on how the light's hitting it, depending on how what just looks right for the situation. So that's been a nice addition to our mannequin toolbox. And then the hair ties were that was a kind of a fun challenge too, because we had decided not to have hair, but there were hair ties. So we eventually came up with this idea that I think you can see a little bit of it here from the back. We used a kind of a foam backer rod and wrapped that in fleece. And then Emil took the shoelaces and did the tying on. And then that whole ensemble just kind of goes around the neck. And then you can see that it just comes around the front of her shoulders there. And then the hair ties hang as though they were.
You can see it with Jane in her photo there, where you see the red ties that are wrapped around her braids. And that was kind of the illusion we were going for with the mannequin, was to make it look like these braids were coming out. And
yeah. So at least it wouldn't be distracting too. That was part of the balance that we, if we couldn't go for full reality, then at least let it not be like, well, why is that even there? So that's also part of that compromise. So last but not least, this is a show called Circle of Dance, which the entire show was curated by our colleague Cecilia Gantome. But you and I worked together a lot on this mannequin.
This is a Northern traditional beaded outfit by a man named Robert Tiger, Boy Tiger. He beaded this outfit. The challenge was putting it into a very small space and trying to get movement out of it.
Yeah, well, the entire reason for this exhibit to be was dance, right? It was to represent in each of those cases a specific dance in a specific pose from a specific place. And the cases were existing cases and we were fitting into those cases. But we did want realism in the pose so that even if there wasn't actual movement happening, that people could connect the pose that was chosen to the video that they're seeing and recognize, oh, that's that one. I see how that one. And so there was a lot of conversations from all the different tribes and groups that on what's the pose that's representative of this dance, and it's not an easy thing to do. So for me, thankfully for this case, you gave me a double bonus, which was a picture of Robert Tiger in the actual regalia and a picture of someone. Who's the gentleman who's dancing?
His name's Terry Fiddler.
Terry Fiddler.
And he's from South Dakota, and he's a champion Northern traditional dancer. And you can see by the pose he's
the model, for this pose. You can't get better than that for having something to work with. And you can see, I just wanted to show in the mannequin before it's dressed that we do build all our mannequins from the ground up, essentially. We work with foam and metal and various things to create the forms. But for these, he was his ensemble is super heavy. That vest alone is feels like 20 pounds.
The belt, yeah, it's heavily beaded. He made it himself. And so we just really wanted to highlight that, and I think you did a good job.
Oh, well, thank you. But because of the weight of it, it's like, the arms had to be reinforced in a slightly different way than we usually do. You can see that the back structure, the shoulders are they're more of a shelf. They have to be more of a shelf to carry all that weight. And then you see the torso that's cut in several pieces to allow us to twist the body to add a little bit more animation as we needed to. And the other thing that was both a challenge and a fun problem to solve for this one was that there would be hands and feet sometimes and faces visible, and we wanted, in a similar way to how it was approached in our universes, we didn't want full-on portraiture, but we wanted each dancer in each of the cases to look like a little bit like they would. So I used a variety of materials to sort of make the dancer to take on some of the features of Robert Tiger, just very generally, like the brow line and a little bit of the cheekbones and a little bit of the nose, and just to have a kind of a look. And then our designers decided for color-wise on this medium gray that would fade into the background of the case, but would still read as identifiable, body parts, but it's clearly not the color that the skin would be. And then we worked with Fosshape to make hands and faces that could, as you can see, for example, with the fan here, there's a mount that holds, this was in process, so it's not quite a finished mount, but there's a mount that holds the fan in place, and it has a variety of set screws and things that allow us to twist it and turn it how we need it to go. And then we could put the hand over that and cut the Foshape so that it's not actually rubbing against the object, and then put everything into place, and it would give the look of the hand holding it. Then that also leads into our other compromise that normally in these ensembles, he'd be wearing a bustle, right?
Yeah, he'd be wearing a feathered bustle, but to have him featured not wearing something would just kind of look out of place. So the compromise was these two spikes with these plumes on the end would have been part of the dance bustle, and then there would have been like a whole feathered thing that would come around the back. So we didn't feature that part, but it looks, you see the illusion that there is a bustle back there just by seeing those plumes that are sticking up from the back.
Mm-hmm. And so it brings us circle back around to fitting in the case again.
Yeah, right.
Because if he were actually leaning over like he is, the way these cases are, the glass kind of slopes back, and so it gets a little shallower the higher you go in the case. And so we needed to make some compromises there. But it does look like, if you look at it from the front here, it does look like his bustle, So, we hope that for these examples, we've introduced you to some of the challenges and the decisions that we've looked at over the years and continue to look at. It's a ever evolving, continuing conversation that we have with some of the same challenges coming up over and over again, but each one pushing us to try to do it a little bit better each time. And hopefully we have, and we'll continue this conversation in the future. Thank you, Emil, so much for being
Well,
here.
thank you for taking me back this far down memory lane here.
All right, so we will get started here. So I guess to begin this, why don't we just give a little bit of an overview of the mannequin fleet that we have here at Kent State University Museum.
So we have over 450 mannequins and dress forms here. Being an institute of fashion design and costume history, that's pretty much our mainstay. So as you can see in this photograph, we have them stacked up almost like cordwood, and they are everywhere. They are in every nook and cranny of the building. So we have several different types. These three are some of our mainstays. On the left is Christie mannequin, which is Christy Turlington's head on Giselle's body. These were made by Pucci in the late 1990s, early 2000s.
I think it's the early 90s, actually.
Early 90s, okay. And then the Toledos were designed by Isabel and Ruben Toledo, specifically for an exhibition that we had here at the museum. And the contemporaries we just recently bought for an exhibition that we're going to talk about coming up really quickly. As you can see, though, all of them are bright white, which is an improvement over what they were when I got here, which was a lovely shade of tantalizing tan, which was supposedly a skin tone, which, as you can imagine, can be problematic. So we decided to make it a more generic tone and get away from any kind of a depiction of a specific skin color. And that's where we are for the most part right now. Sarah, though, in Fashions of South Africa, we decided to go a slightly different direction. So anyway, talk a little bit about the process, because here we were doing a show specifically of objects from the African continent and didn't want to obviously go with bright white mannequins.
Yeah, so our decision here, because we had the bright white mannequins, but, and the other problem about it, because we are dealing with different races, and South Africa in particular is really, they sort of call themselves a rainbow nation, in that they have people of all sorts of diverse cultures and races, and so we wanted to get away from having mannequins that had Christy Turlington's face, because it isn't just sort of a generically white mannequin, literally and figuratively. It's a very specific Caucasian face, and so we wanted to get away from that sort of reference, and so we chose headless mannequins for it, and so we purchased the army of contemporary mannequins in order to use in this exhibition. But then also we had the question of skin tone, and so we made the decision that rather than have them be white, we had them be a light gray, and that was getting away from even the sort of the metaphorical reference to white skin tone. And so that was our decision for the Fashions of Southern Africa. And so because of that, we had the whole collection of contemporary mannequins, we painted a light gray. And then for one of the later exhibitions we had even greater diversity of mannequins when we did our For the Birds exhibition. And so Jim, could you talk a little bit about the decisions that we made in terms of mounts for that?
Yeah, this was a multicultural exhibition, as you can see. And so, for example, the Cheyenne headdress that we had on display, we decided to just eschew putting it on a body at all. That way we avoided having a particularly white face or white mannequin, and it also showed off the object in a more spectacular way, we thought. And then the Christie mannequins, you can see in the right photograph, were very adaptable for Western garments, but we didn't want to necessarily use those for some of the Asian things like the kimonos that you see in the background. So we decided to go with a T mount for those guys. So you can see here the Christie's mannequins are doing a very good job, but we had a Chinese robe in particular that we didn't want to put on a Christie. So we used one of the Toledos because the facial features on those are a little more vague, could be read slightly as Asian or non-Western anyway, and it seemed to work a lot better for that particular garment. So we're always trying to find ways to not, I don't know, we're erring on the side of caution in terms of trying to make sure our mannequins are matching the culture that the garments are from.
Yeah, and it came up in the For the Birds that we have a human body on Western fashion, and then non-Western fashion we display in a much more abstracted way in general with the kimonos, for instance, which were on the tees. And with the Chinese garment, we decided to treat it more like a garment rather than sort of a textile in an abstract manner in order to put it on a body, to sort of contextualize it in a way. Since we're treating things that are Western differently than we're treating things that are non-Western. But of course, then you have the problematic mannequin being specifically Caucasian. So that's why we decided to put it on a mannequin rather than a tee. But then also why the Toledo was chosen rather than one of the Christie mannequins.
So Culture Counterculture is one of our more recent exhibitions, and we were exploring a variety of cultures again. And so we chose mannequins to work with the garments. These are all from the late 60s, early 70s. We also had specific personalities that we were dealing with, and so we want Sarah to kind of address how we dealt with that to start with.
So again, one of the sections, the first section in the exhibition is celebrities. And so we have dresses that have specific links to known people. So we have a dress that was worn by Bess Meyerson, who was Miss America, Dinah Shore, and Kitty Carlisle Hart. So we have their garments, and we decided in those to put them on Christie mannequins. And then we did hairstyles on them because Christie has a head, they allowed to have a hairstyle. So we made hairstyles that are based on images that we found of them. And so we used it that way. But then we also had celebrities that are represented that are African American. So we had a Jimi Hendrix jacket, Lena Horne dresses, Diane Carroll piece, and then a dress that was worn by Diana Ross. And so in that we didn't have heads on our mannequins, and the ones that are on mannequins are on gray mannequins with the headless, which is the same style that we had gone for the Fashions of Southern Africa exhibition. And specifically the Lena Horne mannequins, rather than using one of the ones from our fleet, because of the sleeves, which are so tremendous on this, we had to use specific store mannequins. And so here we have one of the dresses, one of the Lena Horne dresses, and this is a picture of her wearing it to, I think it was the Grammys. And then we dressed it on a headless gray Christie mannequin. And then finally, when it's actually in the exhibition itself, we had it mounted on a store mannequin. So we have these old mannequins that are even from before the days of getting the Christies that are in wild and exuberant poses. And because of the sleeves, we wanted arms that were bent, and the existing contemporary mannequin has down arms that wouldn't work at all on these dresses. So we made the decision to paint and decapitate some of our store mannequins. And the next slide shows the other Lena Horne dress. And this is, so I dug up some old pictures of the mannequin on a different piece. And so you could see it used to be a quote unquote flesh colored mannequin. It was sort of this nude color that they used to use for mannequins here. And then we have since replaced that with white, and then we're now moving towards other colors other than white. And particularly for something for Lena Horne, we wanted to go with the neutral gray. So, and again, her Jim moved her head, and so that's the pose that she now is in. So as we go forward, oh, and here's another view of culture, counterculture. And this shows some of the choices. And actually, to get back to the question of the head versus the non-head, the whole exhibition is sort of premised around this dichotomy between culture and counterculture in the 1960s. And you sort of have high fashion, and then you have sort of streetwear, and you have this sort of these parallel strains that were running through fashion at the time. And so my decision was to give the culture mannequins heads, and the counterculture were the headless, just as a way to divide it, and because we had, two sets of groupings of mannequins. And so the culture mannequins were generally the ones that had the hair, and the counterculture ones were the ones without the heads. And so here you see the decisions. And so we made hair out of paper, of craft paper, and so they have these wigs, and we decided that in addition to having sort of these more Caucasian style hair, we have one that has an afro, which was really an important style innovation from the 1960s, and so that was one of the hairstyles. This one here is we gave our efforts at an afro. And then Jim, I don't know if you could talk a little bit about our decisions in our discussions that we have going forward with what kind of mannequins we are looking to add to the collection.
Yeah, I mean, we, recognize that as the culture is shifting, and with the movements of Black Lives Matter and things like that, that we need to do a better job of adequately representing various cultures, BIPOC cultures. So we're shopping around trying to find, mannequins that represent a more typical Black body, mannequins that are gender fluid, mannequins that are more genericized, facial features that aren't so distinctly white or European or whatever. It's a bit of a challenge, as I'm sure all of you are facing at the same time. And some of the other challenges include, like, how do we manage all of these parts and all of these rainbows of color? If we start to do, brown or metallic or darker grays, suddenly we have an inventory issue where you have, X numbers of arms that are this color, but don't necessarily suit the exhibition you have. So a lot of repainting and stuff that we would like to avoid. And then, of course, just the basic idea, I'm really sorry about that, the basic idea that, what is the proper color to use? How do you pick a particular shade of brown, black, gray, white, to serve your purpose without being insulting or stereotypical or any of those things. So those are some of the things that I think we have to deal with.
Yeah, and we also have, and so in addition to having the issues of sort of color and cultural, racial issues, we have body size and body shape issues. All of the mannequins that we've shown you are all sort of fashion model sizes, and they're also over 6 feet tall, and the people in general, and the people who own these clothes even, were not over 6 foot tall, and they were not necessarily fashion models. And so getting diversity in body type is really hard. It's one thing to just paint the mannequin, but to sort of represent different sizes and shapes is a big challenge. And so it's difficult to know how much you want that to be built into the mannequin and how much you want that to be added when you're dressing in an individual garment.
And we didn't really touch on some of our historic mannequins. We have a small fleet that we call the Kyoto mannequins that are actually fairly adjustable for height and easily padded out. So yeah, there's just a bunch of different things that we're looking at. Those are particularly good because they have historical silhouettes, Belle Epoque, and 18th century, 19th century. So there's just lots of challenges involved in keeping a fleet of mannequins that is workable for the garments you want to show and represent cultures better. So it's just something we're going to keep working on.
All right.
Anything else you can add?
I think we can wrap it up there.
Okay. So we will be open for questions at the end of the presentations. So thanks.
Thank you.
I'm a conservator working at the Anchorage Museum here in Alaska, and I'm not a Mountmaker, but I have been fortunate to be involved in the mannequin making process at various places I've worked, including with Shelley at the National Museum of American Indian. This experience has greatly shaped my approach to mannequins for the safe display of clothing. I wanted to share an example from the opposite point of view, with the deinstallation of an entire gallery and the deconstruction of 30-year-old plaster mannequins based on real people, and the new approach we now use to support clothing realistically but safely. In 2016, the collections department started the challenge of deinstalling the old Alaska gallery, at that time the largest exhibition space in the museum. As a textile conservator, I was relieved as the old dioramas and cases were not sealed. So after 30 years on display, a significant level of dust had built up on the clothing. Also, the old mannequins were very heavy, rigid, and the joints were inflexible. They were not formed to the clothing, often causing stress to the skins or textile fibers. Area around shoulders, bent knees, and buttocks were subsequently deformed and misshaped. The old mannequins were not constructed from archival materials, being moulded from plaster with metal connectors. There was no protective barrier between the mannequins and clothing, with pressure-sensitive tape and plaster being in direct contact. Often the surface of the mannequins was crumbling and powdery, leaving abrasive particles of plaster inside and on the clothing. The parka hoods in particular were often tightly fitted around the mannequin heads and necklines, causing stress to the skins of the fur clothing. The fur was crushed, hair broken from the parkas being positioned under the legs of heavy-weighted mannequin, and in some cases the clothing was hanging unsupported and without appropriate padding. The shape of the mannequins, often being too large and too exaggerated, stretched the fabrics in these areas and permanently deformed the clothing, especially where the mannequin backs were curved and the knees were bent. During deinstallation, there were many occasions where it was incredibly difficult to remove the clothing from the mannequin due to the articulated mannequin positions with bent legs, arms, and feet. We had to assess the best method to remove the torsos and heads from inside the parkas, while trying to mitigate excessive handling often required in this particular circumstance. The old mannequins did not permit safe dressing and undressing of the clothing. Each item of clothing was different, so we had to evaluate each step of a removal on a case-by-case basis. It soon became clear that the mannequins were not constructed exactly the same. Sometimes we were unable to remove the steel connection pins in the arms, so it was necessary to carefully cut through the aluminum joints to remove hands and forearms. This all had to be undertaken under not ideal circumstances, with the mannequin still dressed with the clothing, causing unnecessary and avoidable stress to the skins and textiles, and to the conservators who had to do the work. We also had to be sensitive during this whole process, as the mannequins had been shaped based on real people within the Alaska community. So we did not reuse the old mannequins, but instead the new mannequins are now made from archival materials. Not one is the same shape or size. The new mannequins have been individually padded, but not over padded, which would cause damage to the clothing, putting stress on the seams and stretching the skins. Some of the mannequins feature shoulder wings, which is a clever way to add more padding to the shoulder area, but still allow easy access to connect or remove the mannequin arms. The new mannequins were modified for each item of clothing. Areas of weakness such as the shoulders, upper arms, neckline, parka hoods are now fully supported, reducing stress on the seams and creases in the skins. The mannequins now allow for safe dressing and undressing of the clothing. The final display gives the illusion that the clothing is being worn on the body without looking too human-like or overly bulked out. These beautiful parkas and tunic can be seen in the new Alaska exhibit. Having been part of several programs throughout the museum, we understand the need for Alaskan artists and makers to easily see the construction and embellishment details in order to continue these traditions. And so this, as well as supporting the clothing, is a main focus of our approach to mannequins at the Anchorage Museum.
So much to think about in those three presentations. Just a reminder that we'll be taking your questions at the end of the session, but keep the questions coming. Okay, we have now come to the Now You See Me portion of the day. Both of the following two talks in their own way address specific solutions to challenges around showing human extremities in the mannequins on display. Laura Flecker, Principal Textile Conservation Display Specialist at the Victoria and Albert Museum, London, UK, will talk about her approach to historic versus contemporary mannequins for the Fashion by Nature exhibition. Brett Angel, Senior Exhibitions Preparator for Objects at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston and Boston, Massachusetts, USA, will speak on how a mannequin is converted in a recent exhibition at the MFA.
Right, let's get started. Okay, so over the last few years, the V&A has staged a number of exhibitions about well-known personalities, and the need to find and create suitable mannequins for real people such as David Bowie and Frida Kahlo has taken us on some very interesting journeys. Although I love banging on about these exhibitions, I thought I'd take this opportunity to look at a less high-profile mannequin conundrum that I came across when working on a recent exhibition called Fashion from Nature. The issue was this, and I'm sure it's a familiar one for many: how to create animated figures for multiple historic garments on a small budget. Fashion from Nature was staged at the V&A in 2018. As the title suggests, the exhibition explored the complex relationship between fashion and nature through the ages. This meant that a mix of objects from different periods were to be shown. The list included around 90 outfits spanning 5 centuries, the oldest from the 1600s and the newest from the present day. The curator's display vision was to bring the costumes to life by mounting them on full fiberglass mannequins. Stylized heads were chosen with blown back features and molded hair. This got around the problem of covering bald heads without the need for wigs, which the curator was also keen to avoid. For the contemporary dress, this was fairly straightforward. There are many off-the-shelf mannequins to choose from with blown-back features and moulded hair, and as long as you aren't doing an Alexander McQueen exhibition, they can usually be adapted to fit most modern garments. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for historical dress. Tiny sizes and corseted shapes means that finding anything off the shelf can be tricky. Add in arms, heads, and a moulded hairstyle, and you're asking for a mannequin miracle. It's for this reason that we tend to use simple papier-mâché bust forms at the V&A for historical dress. These basic torsos have the advantage of being cheap and coming in small sizes. They provide a sturdy foundation which can be adapted with padding to the right size and shape to fit individual garments. The figures can then be covered in a top layer of fabric, hiding the padding from view and giving a professional display finish. As purchasing expensive custom-made figures was out of the question, it soon became clear that using a bust form was our only option. The challenge was transforming these headless tailor's dummies into animated figures that could hold their own against the modern mannequins in the show. The curator wanted to avoid the kind of contrast that you can see in this slide and was determined to give the historic dress the same treatment as the contemporary fashion. Fortunately, most suppliers also offer some head and arm options for bust forms. Fabric-covered heads and articulated arms are commonly used in museums, and they seemed the obvious choice for us. Our challenge lay in how to achieve a subtly moulded hairdo. In order to conceal unsightly padding, it was essential for us to use a torso with a fabric finish. But what about the head? Covering moulded hair in material would be very difficult and time-consuming, and it probably wouldn't look that great either. In the end, we solved the problem with papier-mâché. This is what we did. So first of all, we bought a cheap raw papier-mâché bust form, lots of them, and had them covered in a final layer of exhibition paper, and we used this as our display finish. Next, we added adolescent-sized articulated arms to each torso. These are smaller than contemporary sizes and a good fit for historic garments. We then commissioned the mannequin company to make a new head mould with stylized hair. Although the mould itself was pricey, once it had been made, the heads could be churned out very cheaply. These too were finished in a final layer of exhibition paper, and care was taken to follow the natural contours of the hair, which added to the visual effect. It was now down to us to do the rest. The process of making underpinnings, padding up the figure, and covering it in a layer of stretch jersey was carried out as normal. But once this work had been completed, there was one final step. Any jersey visible above the neckline of the costume had to be coated with papier-mâché so that the surface of the torso matched the head. To do this, we marked the neckline of the garment onto the figure and stitched a band of bias tape beneath. This acted as a binding to the papered area and helped prevent it from cockling as it dried. The paper was torn into bits and applied on top of the fabric using wheat starch paste as an adhesive. Special care was taken to blend the new layers of paper with the original neck so that there were no obvious joins and the head could be fitted without difficulty. So this solution was perhaps not the fastest method on record, but it helped bring the historical costume in the exhibition to life in a way that our standard headless torsos could not have done. The lack of mannequin choice for period dress continues to be a big problem and is something that needs tackling, but that's a project for another day.
I'm Brett Angel, and I'm the Senior Exhibitions Preparator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. For this talk, I'm going to cover the extensive mannequin modifications required for the 2019 Endobelly exhibition. This showed both traditional and contemporary Endobelly costumes, and Catherine Gunch was our curator and Joel Thompson was the conservator for this project that I worked with. As you can see from the previous images, brass rings were featured prominently in the women's costumes. We decided to make actual brass rings for this exhibition. I believe I made about between 60 and 70 rings, both for the ankles and the neck itself. So I started by annealing the brass rods that were selected to use for the rings. You can see that on the left. And that, of course, is to make them pliable, to pull them around the form that you see here. While this is a very low-tech procedure, it worked very well and took the better part of one day to fabricate them all. I made the links longer than they needed to be so that it was easy to pull them around the wooden form. Here's the finished, very rough form with the extra parts extending past the circumference of the ring. On the left, you see the rough, unclipped, scorched lengths, and on the right, the excess lengths were cut off. After clipping, and then put each one in a parrot vise to realign the ends so that it looks like a single ring again. Here I'm taking the grinder with a flap disc to quickly finish the top and bottom portions of the ring, removing any scorch marks and metal marks. And here we are with that step completed. And then a final polish with steel wool to give it a shiny, smooth surface overall. So on the left are the finished rings, and on the right, there they are in their kind of more rough state. After the polishing was finished, I stored them in sealed bags until they could be put onto the mannequins. This was all very last minute, which is probably not a surprise to any of us. So there was not adequate time to seal them with any kind of clear coat. So we wore gloves to keep them clean and kept them in bags until the actual installation time. Because the rings are brass, the accumulation of them obviously created a significant amount of weight. We didn't want the weight of the rings pushing down on the lower beaded cuffs, which are actual objects. So I made tabs on the bottommost ring that screwed into the mannequin itself. The mannequins are from MD Studios, and the model is Sintensi, and they're made out of acrylic. And I have to say, for the amount of cutting and drilling and refabricating and reattaching, that these were just absolutely fantastic. So I highly recommend them for anyone else that has to really Frankenstein together a mount. Catherine, our curator, consulted local Endobelly folks to determine what an appropriate color would be. Would we need to paint them? Would we need to cover them with some type of material? In the end, it was decided that a literally black-colored mannequin would be the most appropriate and respectful. In order to be able to put the rings on the mannequin, I had to literally cut the feet off so the rings could be passed over the ankles. That's what you're seeing here, that first initial cut. Here are the countersunk holes. The bolts will eventually go through the heel of the foot and into the ankle. On the left, you can see the threaded brass inserts that will take the bolt on the right. And then here I am attaching the feet and securing the bolts. And here we see the finished look before the mannequin actually gets dressed. Please notice in this picture too the space between the beaded cuffs. The legs had to be intentionally spaced apart, otherwise the cuffs would have been bunching up and rubbing on each other. So as you can see here, there's actually a little bit of space between the cuffs on the bottom, which are the actual objects. And so had we not spaced the legs, those would have been just literally bumping into each other. So in order to do that, here we are with more amputation, unfortunately. You can see on the right, another bracket is set into the mannequin. Here I used a jigsaw to make the cut. The bracket was slotted so that the leg, once it's attached, could have adjustability and be able to move back and forth. Here are the brackets in the body and the leg bracket joined together. On the left, I'm showing you how the bracket can be adjusted by sliding it back and forth in the slots before we lock it down. And on the right is the finished leg attached. And so again, you can probably notice how it can move to the left or the right. On the left is the mannequin then before it gets dressed, and on the right, the fully dressed mannequin. So as you can see, you'd be none the wiser of all the modifications that are going on underneath. Finally, I wanted to show you a really quick radically altered mannequin. On the left is the finished dressed mannequin, and on the right is the cut up mannequin. So as you can see, large portions were removed to fit the petite costume. Notice how thin the breastplate area is cut, and yet it is still quite strong. Again, this is the Intensi mannequin, Sabe type, made out of acrylic. I also had to cut away a portion of the torso length and then reattach it with clips. So that's what you're seeing on the inside. That's what those brass clips are. That's reattaching the upper part of the torso to the lower part. And then finally, this is a detail just to show you that all the finishing was done again with a grinder and a flat disc. So you can see how easy it is to radically alter these mannequins, and then they still hold up. So I'm quite impressed, I have to say, with this particular mannequin type.
Wow, two fantastic solutions. Thank you both. And it's great to see so many questions coming in. Again, we will get to those after this final set of presentations. So the last four talks of this session refer to the "and now you don't" part of the day. In the first presentation, the mannequin must convey a very specific context or purpose with no other material than the costume itself. And in the three presentations that follow, the mount or mannequin needed to give form or reference to a human body without showing a human form beyond the objects themselves. So Sam Gatley of the Object Support Team at the Te Papa Museum in Wellington, New Zealand, will present her solution for a complex mount for a riding habit. Mayor Latouche of Benchmark of Rosemont, New Jersey, USA, will speak on various active and animated forms she has made. Heidi Sharenga, Senior Conservator, Head of Collections Care Management Access Department at the University of British Columbia Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, will present a talk called "There are Two Sides to Everything, a Mannequin for Weavers," where she shares her solutions for an invisible support for chilkat weaving and an internal mount for kwakwat headdress. And finally, Ian Hart, Natural History Exhibit Preparator from San Francisco, California, USA, will present his solutions to mounting a queue of human hair for an exhibit on discrimination, a Mountmaking story.
Hello, I'd like to talk today a little bit about a project I've been involved with over the past year or so, albeit intermittently. And that is, we've been preparing objects for photography for a forthcoming Te Papa Press publication authored by senior curator Claire Renaud. And broadly speaking, the book talks about settlers to New Zealand and what they wore. And we've mounted about 25 full ensembles, and each garment has been specifically mounted and fitted to the form with bespoke underpinnings made for each one. And one of the things that's really struck me whilst doing this is that the time that's gone into preparing each of these for photography is definitely comparable to what you would expect for mounting for display. And this is particularly true of one ensemble that we were very keen to mount in a very specific pose. And that's for this riding habit. You can see it here on the left as it's been prepared previously for the collections online. It's a really beautiful ensemble, three-piece ensemble. It's a boned and fitted tailored jacket with breeches and a skirt. It's made from a really heavy Melton wool and was produced by a company based in Great Britain called Busfine, who in around the mid-Victorian era were among a number of firms that patented this very specific style of skirt called an apron or safety skirt. And they were made really to address the problem of women who, when wearing the full skirts of the period, if in the event of a fall from their horse, could quite easily become entangled in the hooves and dragged along, resulting in some pretty horrific and fatal accidents by all accounts. So the safety skirt was cut so it's very, it's like a false front, and then sits very fittedly over the leading knee when sat side saddle on a horse. And you can see here on the right other institutions with similar ensembles and how they have tried to, how they have addressed presenting the shape of the skirt. But we really wanted to develop a mount that could show the relationship between the three pieces. And of course, the budget was kind of slim, so any solution had to be worked up in-house. And sadly, we couldn't find a horse that was willing to stand still for photography. So we looked around to see what kind of poses might be suitable and ended up settling on this kind of exaggerated stepping pose inspired by the photo here that you can see on the right. We thought that this would be a good way to kind of allude to the side saddle position, but it also would offer some support to the cut of the skirt and take some strain off the waistband. There are some real practical challenges with creating this kind of stance, and the order of dressing is very specific and requires a minimum of 3 people to achieve safely. But the added layer of complexity was that we do want the opportunity or the possibility to put this ensemble on display in the future. And we would like to have the option of displaying it with all the accessories too. So we've been experimenting with using prop gloves and an abstract head. But that's as far as we've got with this at the moment, and we'll still need to have further conversations around the finish of a head, face, hair, and the use of props as well. Overall, all of the garments included in this publication have been finished with this off-white silk jersey. And that's really a decision that's been informed by a design aesthetic for the images. They're very clean white backgrounds that really allow the garments to shine, and so the mount is also a white in order that it will help disappear into the background. Having said that, I think it's fair to say as well that pretty much all in this publication. And interestingly, with the riding habit, we were in a fortunate position of knowing exactly which Caucasian women wore the ensemble. And you can see pictures of her here, albeit some years after we think that she wore it, perhaps as a teenager. But in this case, having information available about the wearer did very little to inform decisions about the mount. Rightly or wrongly, the mount has been designed to really kind of show the relationship between the individual components of the ensemble rather than give any kind of flavour of the wearer, Jessie Meta, and her personality. The final pictures of the newly, freshly finished riding ensemble mount will be taken in a few weeks, and you'll be able to see it when the publication comes out next year. And in the meantime, we began thinking about our future projects, our up-and-coming projects. And Te Papa has a vast collection of Maori and Pacifica treasures, and in particular, we'll be thinking about our approach to the display of some tapa garments that have been requested for next year. And it's great to be a part of this kind of open discussion to help inform our practice. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Latouche from Benchmark, and I have a small presentation of mannequins that I've made that have been in very active poses. And so that's the theme of this slide presentation. Most of the mannequins that I've been asked to make have been solitary standing sort of fashion, like here I am standing upright with this piece of clothing on. But on a couple of occasions, the designer has wanted mannequins to display more action. At the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., there was a gypsy dress that the designer wanted to see in a swirl, like it had just frozen in a dance. A GI standing in a sort of John Wayne hip-slung kind of a fashion. A Nazi guard in a menacing wide-leg stance. The mannequins I'm showing here are from an exhibit at the Flint Center at Historic Deerfield, where the designer had imagined characteristic poses from the lives of those that had worn the clothing. Men and women in elegant 18th century garb together in conversation. A fellow in the army ready to draw his sword, although there was no sword. A young skivvy peeking out at the world of her betters from behind a doorway, a young gallant at a ball, and so on. The mannequins would assume the poses, the portraits on the walls around the space would provide the faces of the time. Let me admit to being a bit cranked when, let me move this over here, to being a bit cranked when this assignment first came my way. The poses were all so very much more activated than we usually had to carve. But once I got over that, it was nothing but fun. This first mannequin is my favorite. This is the dancing gallant. My initial carving was rather upright, as you can see, as I felt my way into his pose. I have a physical memory of this mannequin that involves making a huge slice across the stomach once he was shaped, like seppuku. And into this gash, I glued big chunky wedges of ethifoam that resulted in the graceful backwards bend to his upper body. Likewise, a large slice at the top of his thigh in the back, up here. Another wedge of ethifoam to cant him forward, and there he is in the dancing pose. The infinite workability of ethifoam is one of the things that I really, really like about it. So I say carve. My preferred way to make a mannequin is to find the shape in what amounts to a block of ethafoam. It's a reductive process for me. Of course, mannequin making can be additive. Of course, I used to do that, but I came to feel that carving down to the shape of the real body, even when the parts of that shape would not remotely telegraph through the clothing, was the best and fastest way for me to understand what needed doing. So you'll see that these mannequin shapes are very much human shapes. A frequent element in my mannequins is the use of satin to help slide clothing onto the form. You see it here, you can see it on the upper arms and the shoulder of the dancing man. And here again on the tops of the arms. One of the biggest things to consider in all the mannequins is the dressing, and that mostly, for me, mostly means arms. I haven't dealt with any of the wonderful hardware that's now available to attach arms and to activate joints. So my decisions are always, how long of a solid ethafoam stub can I make beyond the shoulder and still be able to dress the form? At what point do we add to the stub what we call sausage arms, 3-inch stockinette stuffed with polybatting that allows you to stuff the sleeves, stuff the arms into the sleeves of the costume, sort of like dressing a floppy 3-year-old. Or in some cases, do we make removable arms, which I have some examples of coming up in a moment. Here is the guy dressed. You see he's also got a lovely pair of black breeches. And there he is. For the dancing man, because the coat opened up so easily, we didn't need to make removable arms. I can't quite remember, but I think we inserted an aluminum rod, perhaps 3/16 in diameter, into the ethafoam stub and wrapped it around with polybatting in the sausage part. And this allowed his arms to be bent at the elbow and to stay there. This next slide is the army fellow. You see the designer's drawing the concept of his reaching for his sword. In this instance, both arms were moved to dress the mannequin, as you can see in this amended photo. Again, the use of satin slide, and note to myself up top here, which says, this is very forced position for this coat's arms, and I don't recommend it at all. Oh well. To return to the removable arms for a moment, here's the guy dressed. There. The removable arms we do by means of a mortise and tenon. I'll often give that a triangular shape and make it as large as I can. It turns out that a cut ethafoam surface has a great ability to grip to another cut ethafoam surface when it's inserted, and it's a perfect match. And we make use of that in this case. Sometimes we'll augment the mortise and tenon with twill tapes. I'll put twill here and make it into a triangle and have a Velcro at the top, and then I'll go across the shoulder here with a Velcro tab up here. I don't think we did that in this case. It didn't need it. So the next two examples are from the elegant couples that peopled this exhibit, a seated lady and a standing gent with his arms behind his back in a conversational repose. The first slide is again the worksheet I try to keep on every mannequin. Here you can see the drawing that we were given to work to, including my sketch of how we were going to seat her. She's very straightforward, essentially just a torso. Because her bodice was so very tight and very tiny, we made very little by way of solid arms below her actual shoulders. Most of what you see here is the sausage arms. About half of the arm is sausage. The fun of this mannequin was this great petticoat that held her skirt out. And also it was completely, what was very successful about this mannequin, I remember, was the inference of her thighs under the skirt when she was dressed. Hard to see here, but take my word for it. This photo also gives you an idea of the portraits that were used to fill in where our mannequins left off. And now we come to the gentleman. You can see here the concept again of the designer. This is the mannequin that we were to make, and Here was a portrait behind that gave an indication of the people here. The tricky part of this mannequin was that the arms were to be behind his back. Both of the arms had to come off. To accomplish this, we had to remove them both. The dark blue line here shows where the arms came out. The lighter blue is a sort of outline of the satin that help the, you can see it on the back here as well, help the costume slide on. The coat was to be a very tight fit, as you can see here. And so the satin was to help, so I could tweak it once it was dressed. The arms, because they both removed, it was very easy to dress the mannequin here. They were easily inserted into the sleeves of the coat, but nonetheless, we made very deep V's, V cuts at the elbow in the ethifoam. And this allowed us somewhat to flex the ethifoam to get it into the sleeve. And then once it was dressed, the bent shape would just resume. Because the arms were rather meaty in this instance, it was a good choice. And again, they were covered in satin to help the slide. Lastly, since we're talking about mortise and tenon, I wanted to show you an example of a different use rather than for removable arms. Many Native American dresses have to be shown with the arms straight out in kindness to the heavily beaded yokes that so many of them have. Our solution to dressing these gals again makes use of the mortise and tenon. Here you see the arms half of the mannequin with the mortise on the underside. The photo is a bit hard to read, but this is the stub of the neck with, we're looking at it from the underside. This is the stub of the neck with the exhibit fabric on it. Also at the ends of the arms, the exhibit fabric. So this part of the form, of the mannequin form, slides into the dress from one wrist through to the other wrist. Of course, you have to pay attention here that this dimension will easily insert at that point. And so we spent a little bit of time making sure that it was reduced enough to be able to go through. But once the dress is on here, it can be very easily carried over to the torso part of the form. And here you see the torso. This is the tenon hidden behind the bust. And excuse me, once you have the mannequin, once you have the dress on the mannequin, you can just lift it up and lower it onto that tenon very easily. It is really, really easy. And here you see it assembled. And also here assembled. You see that the black line, of course, is my drawing on there to show you where the seam would be. Okay, so those are just a few of my ideas, a few examples of activated mannequins that we have made in the past, and I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks a lot.
I wanted to share with you today 2 examples of mounting solutions that we have come up with here at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC in response to a couple different problems. One was that question we all love, which is make us a mannequin that's invisible. And the other is the solution to the question of how can we mount something so that it can be worn in ceremony. So the first is this chilkat weaving. It was one of the pieces that was selected for an exhibit that's currently on now, entitled In a Different Light, Reflection on Northwest Coast Art. And it presents over 100 historic Indigenous artworks through the voices of contemporary First Nations artists and community members. So these are presented to the public through stories and through tellings and through different ways of understanding that might normally be seen at the museum. And for this piece in particular, it was important for it to be presented for the weavers. And every weaver that I have known is always deeply interested in the back of the weaving, even more so than they are in the front of the weaving, because all of the starts and stops reveal a massive amount of information about the weaver or the decisions that they made about their weaving. And William White is a Cinchin Chilkat weaver, and he has taught us over and over again how important this is. And he was the one speaking to this weaving in the exhibit. And with his guidance and with the curatorial guidance, we came up with the idea of the invisible mount that I'm going to show you now. And we were challenged because it couldn't be presented flat in a case, like you'd be able to see both sides. They wanted it to be presented as though it would be on a form, as though it was being worn by somebody. So the first step for us is understanding what that form would look like. And anybody who's worked with the weaving, it's quite hard to imagine it unless you actually are able to drape it over somebody to see how it hangs. So we had one of the curators involved, Phil McLennan, serve that role for us to wear the robe so that we could understand how it would fall. And then from that, we were able to carve down an Epiphone form that was the same shape as him as he was holding his arms, and we knew it would fit into the case in this form. The next step here was to put in a little bit of structure so that the weaving could be supported. We knew we wanted to work with fox shape because it was thin and light enough in order to make that invisibility happen that we were looking for. So my colleague and I, Carl Schlichting, worked together, and he manufactured, designed and manufactured this metal armature underneath. And what you're seeing here is the metal flat bar that has been painted, and it's also got perforations along the length, which we'll speak to in a moment. So you can see this over top of the Tyvek that we're using as the template for the cutting of the fox shape. And here you can see the cut and set fox shape in shape over top of the metal form. And then you can see along the edges the zap straps that we threaded through the holes in the flat bar in order to secure it in place. Now, the challenge with the fox shape is it does a great job in creating that form, but it's still on its own won't support the width or the weight of the blanket crossways. So Carl came up with inserting these, we were calling them ribs, stainless steel rod ribs that were bent into shape and that I stitched through to the fox shape, and they did a wonderful job of taking that weight. And then the last component of the form itself was around the neck, where there was just a little bit too much weight and too much pull. We weren't happy with the way it was settling on the mount. And we resolved that by putting in a little extra dimension using 4-ply black mat board. And then here you have the mount after it's been covered with black cotton jersey. You can see a little bit of the fox shape poking through on the bottom, and then the arms or the feet that extended to the case base. And then the final result here, where we have a wonderful open view into the interior of the weaving, where you can see all of that working. And then I should note that the whole write-up for this mount is being included in the updated publication on mount making from the Canadian Conservation Institute. This is a second example, which is not a mannequin per se, but it is definitely a mount for the people, and in fact, an actual person. This is a Thunderbird headdress that had been requested to travel to Alert Bay for use in a potlatch by the family that had originally held this in its possession and still held the rights to use it. And I worked on this solution with the late Kwak artist and hereditary chief Bo Dick. And together we worked on not only, or he recreated the missing elements. I dealt with strengthening the wood so that it could be danced. But the other thing that we had to work with is the fact that the rigging, the interior rigging was missing, and as such, it couldn't be used. And Bo had, when we were tossing the ideas around, he had said that, well, we might, we would have used a hat, stitch a hat through it, but that had some challenges. What hat? Where was I going to find a hat? What size of hat? But then, of course, I immediately thought fox shape might be able to do this. And the dancer who would be using it wasn't in Vancouver. He was up in Alert Bay, which is a 7-hour commute. So I had to work with measurements that I could get from people at NOAA, but everybody was very helpful. And together we came up with what is basically a hat on the inside. And that was stitched to a donut, which was being used to take up the excess space. Otherwise, the headdress would have sat too low. And then once we were up in Alert Bay, we were able to do the fitting. This is Daryl Dawson, who was going to be dancing the headdress. And you can see here the boss shape is not quite set. I left that final setting to be done after the fitting. And then following this, it was covered with black jersey. And then we were also able to stitch in the other component of the rigging, which is the bands, the large bands that wrap around the waist of the dancer. And you have, this is myself and Bo in the hotel room late at night before the morning activities at the potlatch, where he's just fitting the final pieces in place. And then I'm stitching everything together on the headdress. And it actually worked out quite well. And now we really acknowledge that these changes in the use are part of the headdress. So they weren't removed when it came back from travel. They're on display with the headdress as it is in our visible storage multiversity gallery.
I want to tell you a story about mounting a queue of human hair for an exhibit on racial discrimination that was part of the 2019 exhibition Skin, Living Armor, Evolving Identity, produced and presented at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. The show opened in the spring and ran for about 6 months. The first part of the exhibition was about the comparative biology of skin. It presented a diversity of animal skin types, functions, and products, including scales, feathers, and hair. The second part of the exhibition was devoted to topics related to human skin and skin color. The biology, physiology, and evolution of dark and light skin pigmentation in humans was presented, followed by a history of racial discrimination and the cultural evolution of racial identities in the Americas and in the US in particular. While curating this section of the show, our exhibit developer, Ryder Diaz, reached out to the Chinese Historical Society of America, a culturally specific history museum located in San Francisco's Chinatown, for ideas about what objects in their collection might help to tell the story of racial definition and discrimination with a local focus. Collection stewards at the CHSA suggested several objects. One of those was the queue that is the subject of this talk. A 41-inch long braid of human hair interwoven with silk cords. It's more than 100 years old. A 19th century San Francisco law known as the Q Ordinance empowered law enforcement to cut off the long braided hair worn by Chinese men at the time. Because of this history, and because hair is a product of our skin, the Q was a natural choice for the exhibit. The exhibit production team, including the developer, designer, Mountmaker, and registrar, visited the CHSA to assess the Q, its physical and effective condition, and discuss mounting possibilities with CHSA staff. Together, we decided to mount the Q vertically. We wanted to show the braided hair in a position that would associate it with a real person, its former wearer. We felt that showing the Q in another position, stretched out horizontally, for example, or coiled up, as it was in its storage container, would not promote the same effect. With the mounting concept decided, the main challenge was then how to support and position the Q in the vertical position we chose. The plan, a removable mat to which the Q would be attached and a separate wedge built into the case back to hold it. The mat would be secured to the wedge with adhesive backed hook and loop. I chose matte board for the facing panel because its surface qualities were similar to the matte painted interiors of the rest of the display cases, Its low profile would also allow us to get more tilt out of the shallow case. The attachment for the queue to the facing panel? Ribbons, cut from black crepeline, pulled through slots cut in the matte board. Crepeline, if you aren't familiar with it, is a very fine open weave silk fabric. There are 2 crepeline ribbons supporting the tassel in this photo close-up. Here's the materials list. And now, on to methods. I marked key features of the queue on folder stock and cleanly transferred this pattern to the matte board with pinpricks. A neat ribbon can be made from crepeline by cutting perfectly along the grain. It was efficient to pull a series of threads from the fabric and then cut the ribbons. I found it helpful to weigh down one or both sides of the fabric as I cut. An optivisor and tweezers were other pieces of indispensable equipment for working with this very fine fabric. After making slits in the mat to pass the ribbons through, I widened and then burnished the slits with a scalpel and dental pick. Then, I pushed the first end of the ribbons through the mat using folder stock. After positioning the queue on the mat according to the transfer marks, I brought the free end of the crepeline ribbon over the queue, shielding it with a paper scrap to avoid catching any hairs, and then used folder stock again to push the second end of the ribbon through to the back of the mat. I knotted the crepeline ribbons on the back and taped down the free ends to prevent movement and interference with the hook and loop. The tassel cords needed a little detailed positioning work with thread. With that done, the matted queue was ready to install in the case. Here is the wedge that will receive the mat. The bottom of the mat rested on a small metal lip shown by the arrow. On the right, the adhesive-backed Velcro is installed, and the wedge is ready. Once the queue was installed, I resolved a few unexpected position and support issues with stainless steel insect pins inserted into the mat. Now, the case was closed. The window, acrylic, was screwed into the case sides, sandwiched by face and backing frames. I gave a final wipe down to the front of the window, working from the top to the bottom. But what is this? At the bottom of the window, the silk cords are waving in time to my cleaning motion, and so are the hairs. My bare hand on the window had the same effect as the cleaning cloth you see in this video reconstruction. It turns out that hands in nylon are pretty good at imparting a negative charge to acrylic. The charged plastic, in turn, induces a charge imbalance in the silken hair, causing them to move. A triboelectric series, shown in black pen here, can help predict how materials may transfer charge when brought into contact. After testing a sample of Optium acrylic, which is made to have anti-static properties, we purchased a replacement window made of it. This solved the problem. Our project manager, Andrea Mode, was very responsive and authorized the expenditure right away. In order to avoid further handling of the queue upon deinstallation, because some breakage and hair loss did occur when the queue was coiled and uncoiled, we decided to create a new container for it and return the queue to the CHSA still attached to its mount. This was also done because of the possibility that the queue might travel in a new edition of the show. I want to step back and tell another story about this process, which involves working conditions. The mount was made in the gallery during our object installation period over the course of 2 days, instead of the workspace where we mounted the rest of the show. That workspace wasn't clean or secure enough. We had a moth problem there, and we felt that our mitigation attempts weren't sufficient to care for the queue properly. Fortunately, the gallery did not have a prior history of moth infestation, though we took extra precautions anyway, and it did have extra security because of the rhinoceros horn that was in the show. And now to step back a bit further. Many of you probably experienced a pause in your normal day-to-day work this past year. The California Academy of Sciences shut down due to COVID on the evening of March 12th. While our typical hands-on work was suspended, we had the opportunity to put time and effort into professional, departmental, and institutional reflection and planning. In the course of this work, I became acquainted, for the first time, with the International Council of Museums Code of Ethics. Several sections deal with ethical standards for human remains. Here is my summary. Now, I know that some of my colleagues on the production team were acquainted with the ICOM standards prior to this episode, but I didn't hear about them during this project. Nevertheless, there seemed to be a consensus around our decisions. Looking back, I'm glad we paid extra attention to our work with the Q. However, it's easy for me to imagine any of these decisions being made differently for reasons of time and budget. Or even if we'd had a project manager with different priorities. I hope you think that the work I've described here conforms to ethical standards for the exhibition of sensitive materials. And if not, I would love to hear why. Advocacy for ethical and professional standards can begin with any of us, if we are aware of what those standards are. How do you talk about standards where you work?
Wow, we covered a lot of ground with those presentations, and I see that the Q&A is been quite busy. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Laura McClure. Laura?
Hey, y'all. Yeah, that was amazing. And there are, of course, a ton of questions. The first question that we're going to ask is to Emila and Sarah. Can you please talk about the curatorial perspective and how you visualize your exhibits and the mannequins within? Do you see the poses as you choose the garments, or does that reveal itself later during the process of all the other things going on?
Do you mean me, Sarah? I'm sorry about the question. How do we make the curatorial decisions going along?
Yeah, how do you, when you're planning an exhibit, do you see the poses as you're choosing those garments, or does that sort of reveal itself within the process?
Yeah, I think it definitely reveals itself as part of the process. And I thought it was interesting to see people who had sort of designed their vision for the pose and then created the pose. And a lot of what we work with are, we have pretty standard, we have the mannequins that have the pose that they come with. Since we're using, the pre-made mannequins rather than creating them. So I sort of have to work with what I have. And then the Lena Horne dress that had the really dramatic arms, that was really a function of the sleeves that needed to be shown off. And there's certain logistics that I was looking for, like the arms just needed to be raised in order to see them. And the pose just happened to be the pose that we had for the mannequin, and it worked really well. But we don't really, using the sort of the fleet of mannequins that we don't have as many options if we're going to go that route, since we tend not to make custom mannequins as much for shows. We do a lot of using the pre-designed mannequin. So I don't have as much of a vision going into it that's realized. It's more, a pragmatic decision.
Right.
And in other exhibitions, we do actually go the extra mile. So for example, we have Katharine Hepburn's collection of costumes in our collection, and we did an exhibition of her stuff. And she was known for wearing pants, which was not typical for women. So we developed articulated mannequins that I've presented at previous conferences, where we could pose the pants in various poses to match photographs and things like that. So it's a little bit of a mix of, what we do, but we're a really, really small staff, so it's pretty limited.
Right. We have a question from Gwen Spicer. And she says, I'm pleased that you both mentioned body type. At the National Museum of African American History Culture, this was a real issue, and the Dorfman forms were selected and very much undersized and ill-fitted. How can we as a group get companies to assist us in these needs?
Yeah, I wish we were a bigger market, because I think that's, part of the problem. It's such a niche, but it really is a problem. And the mannequins, the thing is that, we pad out the mannequins to make them fit the size, but you're limited with what you can do in terms of arms and shoulders, and it needs to fit a bigger shape, or a different shape, not a 6 foot tall shape. That's one of the weird things about it, is that they're like too tall, and there's just not so much you can do about that. So yeah, that is a real concern.
And we are trying to source some things out that way. Sarah and our director, Sarah, have located a company that is doing specifically Black mannequins. So different body types, different shapes. And was it Poochie, Sarah, that was doing the gender neutral, gender fluid? Manex, yeah. So we are trying to find them, but like Sarah said, we're a pretty small market compared to retail. And you would hope that retail, though, would be starting to respond to the cultural shifts too, which might make it a little bit easier. Well, fingers crossed.
Yeah, and Poochie does have sizes, mannequins that come in different sizes, and those go like 2, 4, 8, 12, maybe 16, I think. So that is a promising direction too. And yeah, I would certainly think that store mannequins would head that direction, but slow.
And we also have a question from Vincent. And he says, I want to thank you for your bravery and candidness in presenting your difficulties with mannequins and cultural representation. I would like to point out that though that it seems like you chose the dominant culture to have heads, and you avoided heads for ethnic and counterculture mannequins. Can you explain this choice again in this light? Being headless does send a somewhat disparaging message when compared. Why not all headless?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I will say that, well, first of all, the reason why they're not all headless is that we have the Christie mannequin. We don't have enough of the headless mannequins to do the whole show with headless mannequins. And the Christie mannequins have the heads, and so there had to be some division made of like which ones were getting heads and which ones weren't getting heads, because I sort of like not having heads for anything, and it saves us from doing hair, but the higher ups don't like the idea of decapitating all of our mannequins because it's a one-way street and we can't get the heads back on them once we go that route. So I've been overruled so far on decapitating the fleet. But and I think that's a really interesting point. And I have to say that I didn't actually think of it as so much a gesture against the ones that don't have heads. Although, point taken, I hear you. And also I will say that ultimately the distinction between culture and counterculture became very diffuse, and it's not explicit in the exhibition. I don't think anyone going through it would pick up like which ones don't have heads and which ones do have heads, because as I was going through and sort of curatorially, the division between what is culture and what is counterculture became very nebulous, and it was very hard to keep track of what I was even saying was culture and counterculture. And while certainly, the culture represented the establishment and the power structure, and the counterculture would be people of minorities, I think in a lot of ways, the dresses that were associated with the culture could very easily have been worn by minorities, could have been worn by, African Americans, certainly dressed in the same styles, and the hair was also, I looked at pictures of African American women and their hairstyles, as well as white women, and the hair, it's not distinct or clear. I mean, obviously it's Christy Turlington's face, and so it's saying they're white, but that's not necessarily inherent in which pieces were had the heads and which pieces didn't have the heads. But no, and that is really important to think about, who's getting heads and who's not getting heads if we're making those decisions. And I think it is interesting to hear that is, interpreted as a value judgment against the headless. Because for me, a lot of the decision in not having heads is logistical. Like, does the head need hair? Is the mannequin that's going to fit, is that a mannequin that happens to have a head? So there's a lot of decisions that are made that are not judgment, but it is really, important to keep in mind the potential.
Right. Our next question is to the wonderful presenters. Will you discuss the pros and cons of using modified off-the-shelf forms versus custom made?
Time. Mostly time for us, because we have so many that are already in stock. I'm working right now on making 10 mounts for some vests, and it's going to take me the better part of this week. So I don't always have that luxury.
And I do a lot of the mounts as well, and I'm the curator. I handle the social media. Sometimes I teach classes. So we just have we're like a short staff, and there's logistical issues that tend to govern things.
Okay. For Sarah and Jim, how do you inventory and keep track of the variety of mannequins and what features they have, or what colors they are at a given time? Is it a lot of visual sorting, or do you maintain a detailed inventory?
That is something that we just tackled this past summer, I'm happy to say. We found a cloud-based relational database called Airtable that's free, which is great. And my students went through and inventoried and tagged with barcodes every single mannequin, noted their location, took a photograph, inventoried how many arms we have. So we actually have a really good system now for keeping track of it. If only I would actually, get out my phone and note when I move mannequins. So, we'll get there. But one of the things with our conversations about introducing color is going to be, how do we track, there are 6 Christie mannequins that are painted a darker tone, and which arms go with it, because not all the arms are identical. So there will be some logistical challenges, but yeah, the barcoding has helped immensely, because we can literally just pull out your smartphone, shoot the barcode, it'll tell you, what shows that mannequin's been in, what condition it's in, all that kind of stuff.
Okay. We have a question for Laura Flecker, which is, can you share your brand and source of exhibition paper?
Well, to be honest, I would have to look that up. In the case of the Fashion from Nature exhibition, we used a recycled paper that was actually used within the design of the exhibition, and that was how it was selected. So I can't actually remember at this moment where we got it from, but I could certainly look that up. But it wasn't, it wasn't a specific exhibition paper. It was a paper that was chosen by designers to be used within the exhibition, and it was a recycled paper. Obviously, had been chosen for this exhibition because it was all about nature and fashion and recycling and all the rest of it. So, sorry not to be able to answer that a little bit more clearly.
It's nice that it was recycled.
It's nice that it was.
Okay, our next question is for Mare. What archival / tested satin would you recommend for using on your forms?
Well, I don't have that much access to fabric, and so I have to confess it was Joanne's finest satin or China silk. White, washed, ironed, and that was the whole of it.
Joanne's is awesome. We've got a.
I hardly even have a Joanne near me anymore.
Oh no.
Yeah, fabric stores are disappearing.
We all have to go out and buy fabric. Our next question is for Sam. Sam, what is a foam coat?
A foam coat is a product that was first introduced to me by Shelley a couple of years back, and I've only recently had an opportunity to use it. And it's a non-toxic water-based coating that comes in powder form, and you mix that with water and you can apply it to all different kinds of foams, whether that's polystyrene or it's used a lot in the prop kind of world as I think as well. But perhaps Shelley and I know the V&A have used it a lot as well, so perhaps you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, I first learned about foam coat from Fred Sager and the folks at the Met because they used it a number of years ago on a mount for an Etruscan chariot, where they used ethafoam and then coated it with the foam coat to paint on it and make it look like wood. So I think it's kind of a gesso-like material that's used in theatrical, movie sets and stuff like that. But they're the ones who discovered it in my head.
And actually, can I just say something? The joy of it is that you can sand it and make it look like fiberglass, and so certainly at the V&A we've used it to kind of, where we've had to cut off the back of a heel in order to get a pair of trousers on, and then you can kind of build a smaller heel and sand it back and paint it and make it look like the mannequin. So it's really versatile. It's great stuff.
Yeah, we've used it for that kind of thing too. Not necessarily. There was an exhibit actually that I worked on with Emil also, that we had a fiberglass horse in the exhibit that was pulling a travois, and then it would also have a dog pulling a smaller travois. And we couldn't find a fiberglass dog, but all we could find was a cloth covered dog. So I had to coat it with foam coat and then make it look fiberglassy.
Do you have a supplier for that?
I think through theatrical companies, I just Googled foam coat. I think like Dazian or, those kind of places.
Yeah. Shelley, we actually have another question for you, so don't go anywhere yet. What material is the gray mount of the Circle of Life, and what is the gray finish made with?
So that is Foshape. All the hands and the faces and the feet, anything that was exposed in that exhibit, in the Circle of Dance exhibit, were covered with Foshape essentially. And the way that I got those sculptural, the way I created the molds were in a variety of ways. So for the heads, I had some, extra foam around, and then I used this material called Sculptamold. That's just like a cellulose, like you use in kindergarten, to make, you put water in it and you stick it on things. And that doesn't stay in the case. That I just kind of used to build up on top of the foam to create cheekbones and brow lines and noses and things. and then let that all dry. And then I use that to wrap the false shape around. And so what's going on, and then the false shape, after that's steamed, then that holds its shape. And then we painted it with gray latex, low VOC latex paint that had been approved, which really changed the texture of the false shape and made it starts out a little bit rough, but it made it very rough. So anywhere that there's an overlap with the garment, there's a good layer of padding between the two, felt or whatever. So that's how the heads were done. And then the hands we kind of whittled down the number of poses with hands that we needed. So there were quite a few men holding things in their right hand. so we got a bunch of people together and did like a hand, a bunch of little just hand molds where we kind of had a party where I invited a bunch of people in the conservation and collections departments and all the men that I could get in for the male poses, and just had people do those poses. And then we used those casts and wrapped the false shape around it. And then, you take off the false shape and you essentially have a skin that you can use you can cut around and wrap around any of the real support that's going on underneath. So there are mounts holding up the headdresses and things like that are separate. And then the skins kind of wrap around.
That is so cool. And while I have you here, and maybe Emil can chime in too, Karen has said, I see all these beaded dance ensembles are relatively contemporary, worn by modern people. Do you have and work with any older collections made in the past, and have those survived?
Emil, do you?
I know. I was just thinking of Identity by Design. We still used older materials. I mean, older dresses for that. It wasn't just a contemporary. It was just, I think the oldest one we had was the side fold dress that had, was like early 1800s, in which we had to build a mount for that. That was just virtually, the dress had to be laid flat, and that's how it was stored later. But I don't know, do you want to add something?
Well, I think that you really hit on something there, because I think that depending on the fragility of the garment, no matter what age it is, that does restrict what we can do with it. And so for all the garments that were in the Circle of Dance exhibit, for example, because those were so animated, or with the dresses in the contemporary dance section of Identity by Design, we knew that there was more, of course, we consulted with our conservation department to see what the dresses could actually do. And so for many of the older dresses, we definitely could not, kind of wrap them around and do all kinds of things, that we might be more restricted in what the beads can take, or, any of the limitations there.
Well, I remember one of the, if you remember, one of the little girls' dresses, a small one that's fully bead at the top, the skirt, everything. And that one, we used it in this exhibition, and I think it was selected we thought about sending it for another exhibition, but we found after it was in storage that a lot of the beads were falling off it. So we restricted the traveling of that dress because it's so fragile and the beads were falling off, but it's a beautiful dress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we definitely mount older garments, but just maybe not in the exact same way.
And we have a question that is, where did it go? This is from social media. With all the different, more animated poses, how does that impact the costume? Can it create folds or creases? Can it create stress on the fabric?
Is this still Shelley and I, or?
I think this is open to anyone.
Oh, okay. All right.
You're here, so you should answer.
Well, I think for us, I mean, I think the ones that really did, and then Shelley probably hit this earlier, was that the more contemporary ones have the ones that have the more shape and the more movement to it, and things that newly required. I think the historic ones, we really were careful about those and how they were displayed and mounted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure that's something that everybody who makes mannequins has to think about. You know, it is, well, for light reasons and for, you know, obviously creasing the fabric and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's definitely something that you think about for sure, and that you consult with your conservators and figure out what can be done, what should be done.
Right. For Laura, can you please go through the way the head was blended to the paper mache torso? What materials did you use? How long did it take to dry? And how long did it take you to adapt one mannequin?
So so the blending was interesting. So what you have to remember is that we bought papier-mâché torsos already and a head, which were covered in this exhibition paper. So we had the head and we had the torso. The padding was then sort of all over the body. And what the task we had to do was, because we covered the padding in fabric, it was blending the neck in over the top of the fabric so that you couldn't see any join. And we did that by, I finished the fabric with a very tight band of bias binding to make it as flat to the neck as possible, and then covered the layers of paper over the top. I hope that kind of makes sense. The paper, I mean, papier-mâché, basically, it's not a fast drying thing, and I tended to do it last thing in the day and would leave it to dry overnight before putting a second layer on. And I was putting sort of 2, sometimes 3 layers over the top to make a good sound, solid finish to the whole thing. And how long did it take me to adapt and pad up, presumably one mannequin? I mean, it does depend terribly on you know the extremeness of the shape and the size of the figure that you start off with. It could take anything, you know, the resculpting of the body itself could take anything from, I don't know, a day to 3 or 4 days even. But then when you add on underpinnings, particularly something as extreme as that sort of very large pannier frame that I had to make, that's obviously additional time on top. And also if you're making replicas and things, that's also extra time. So it's not a historical costume doesn't tend to be a speedy process, a speedy costume to mount, but and then when you add in the layers of paper that you had to add in as well, it wasn't fast. But yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question.
I think it does. Brett Angel, how often are you asked to recreate ornaments and design components for costumes or other?
That was really the first time. I mean, often the MFA Boston has a huge costume collection and accessory collection, and so often I'm just making mounts to help stabilize or have some way for the accessories to attach. But this is probably the first time that I actually made finished pieces that were going to be visible as accessories. So it was a new first for me.
And then really quickly, do you know who the maker is of those acrylic mannequins?
The brand is MD Studios, and if you're in the US or on the East Coast, we get them from New York City from a place called DK Display Corp. They have a website, so you can get them locally if you're in the US.
Okay.
I'm popping, it's Lauren, I'm popping back in as moderator, and I hate to interrupt when there's so many good questions, but this is all the time we have. But I encourage you to take your questions and join us at the after party so you can keep the talk going. If you're not registered, you can register at the mountmakersforum.net. And don't freak out, you'll be put in a waiting room. Just stay put. Someone will let you into the party once the host has started things. So thank you everyone for fantastic presentations and lively discussions, and thanks to all the back of house. Take care, have a good evening. See you soon.